My name is Ursula Mindler. I'm an assistant professor at Karl Franzens University Graz and Andrássy University in Budapest, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our first panel in this afternoon, dealing with agency, media, the Holocaust, and representative. I read the abstracts with great interest, and I look forward to today's talks. But first, I will briefly introduce our first speaker. Gabriel Meyer attended Boston University, graduating with a degree in art history, and subsequently obtained his MD from Boston University Medical School. After many years of clinical practice and research, he moved to Israel. Currently an MA candidate at Haifa University in the Holocaust Studies Department, he has written and lectured on the Holocaust in Transylvania, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust denial. Current research interests include authenticity in the Holocaust Museum and Jewish soldiers in the former Soviet Union during World War II. Today, he's going to talk about authenticity and limits of representation. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be invited here. It's also a great pleasure because we're all close friends, so we collaborated somewhat in coming here. So it's a double pleasure. Okay, now I'm going to start. Let's see if this works. Working. I want to show you a short movie clip. How do you click on it? I can't see the icon because it's so small. You see, so small I can't see the icon. When it gets bigger, I can see the icon. You have to click somewhere here.
Did you have to click on this one?
No, it's right here. We found the icon. Is the audio on? No audio. Nope. Stop everything.
You plug in something.
Well, you have to plug in what it is. Well, there's an audio plug here. It's going somewhere here. And it's here, but it's not working.
I'll get help from the technician. Great. What's this?
Must be work. It's here, yeah. Okay.
You think it works now?
Yeah.
Let's see. No audio. So that's the whole purpose of showing it. So.
Let's see.
Oh, it's not turned up. Brilliant.
It's about this.
Wow, you.
Sorry, no.
Wow. Who would have thought of that, turning up the audio? Thank you. Okay, now we're going to try again.
And your feeling disappeared. You were dead with your feeling. You had no feeling at all. As a matter of fact, I went into a gas chamber. When I was chosen in over there to work as a barber, some of women that came in from a transport for mine, and from the number of women, I know a lot of people.
You knew them?
I know them. I live with them in my street. And some of them, they were my close friends. And when they saw me, all of them started hugging me. And that, what are you doing here? What's going to happen with us? What could you tell them? What could you tell? A friend of me worked as a barber. He was also a good barber in my hometown. When his wife and his sister to the gas chamber,
This scene is what Annette Imsdorf calls the aesthetic of discomfort. The outline of the talk is to try to define agency and representation. The outline follows first some familiar topics, war newsreel documentary footage, also, also documentary footage as it makes its way into the movie. Some of this is addressed in Zahava's talk. The technique of montage and how it forms the movie narrative, witnessing, fiction, and related elements, commercial and social. I think Madene mentions music, and music was mentioned earlier. You know, the various elements that were not sitting present at the camps or in the Holocaust. The implications, both social and political, and how then they affect culture and memory. And I want to just throw out trace if you're familiar with the work of Pierre Nora. At least we look for trace. This will be more emphasized in the conclusion or discussion of my paper. And what does current cinema have to offer? Is it agency of the victim and survivor, or is it exploitation? And finally, the conflict between what's representation and what I term as reperpetration. This paper will commence by offering a review of the formative standards affecting the moving image in Holocaust representation. We then move forward to contemporary considerations, offer a critique of current trends, and finally, suggest acceptable approaches to representations. Since most films addressing the Holocaust as a genre purport to represent authentic or historical information, we may begin by addressing the term authenticity. It is defined by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as the term authentic is used either in the strong sense of being of undisputed origin or authorship, or in a weaker sense of being faithful to an original or a reliable, accurate representation. To say that something is authentic is to say what it is, what it professes to be, or what it is reputed to be in origin or authorship. Our title also addresses the concept of agency, and it may be useful to make a prima facie case that the Holocaust was a singularly Jewish event, founded on anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, and manifested as the final solution. We may observe that for the exception of original wartime footage, all film is representational. Thus, the genre of Holocaust film and television has to address a moral obligation to the victim and perhaps history as well. Elie Wiesel famously stated, the question is not what to transmit, but how. In the foreword to the second 1989 edition of Annette Imsdorf's now classic textbook, Indelible Shadows, Elie Wiesel begins by quoting the Rabbi of Kotzky. There are truths which cannot be communicated by the word. There are deeper truths that can be transmitted only by silence. And another level are those which cannot be expressed, not even by silence. And Wiesel adds, and yet this story must be communicated. Film and television exist in a world that depends on an audience and economics, which may or may not be subject to political or social pressures, but also subjected by cultural and scholarships from multiple disciplines. Thus, the task before a moral filmmaker is to develop cinematic technique alongside appropriate narrative strategies. There have been some fine documentaries about the Holocaust. The World at War, the series episodes that address the final solutions are very good examples. And most newsreel and armed forces films transmit reality images. Many other examples are found in archival footage, which unfortunately are dominated by atrocity visualization due to availability and the nature of the crime. That's one from, I think the British War Department was compiling footage. Hitchcock never finished the actual movie that was supposed to be made, but many of these can be found on YouTube. And then mentioned today was the film Unfinished, which has uncovered very, very unusual and not before seen footage. Many other examples are found, and afterwards, I think the next move that took place was that of montage. One of the best-known early montage films was Alain Resnais's Night and Fog, and there are other works which incorporate footage in order to develop a story. One of them is the 1959 Judgment of Nuremberg. We saw very good outtakes yesterday from that, I think. And no, actually it was Playhouse 90, but they used the same footage, yeah. While individuals are capable of multiple representation, the ability of film to alter the meaning, as well as the psychology of a series of images through montage, is unsurpassed. And Elie Wiesel again put it, "You see, memory is more than an isolated event, more even than the sum of these events. Facts pulled out of their context can turn out to be misleading." Andrew Hubbard has addressed the utilization of montage in an article called Disruptive Histories, where he explains, Resnais's use of archival material juxtaposed with the present-day footage worked to defamiliarize the archive and to complicate a facile distinction between past and present. Hubbard goes on to explain the various psychological aspects contained in and elicited by Holocaust cinema. Ironically, Night and Fog, serving as an example of highly polished montage, still ranks as a worthy example. And Hubbard added this observation: the distinction between the past and the present has become one of the primary focuses concerning works of the Holocaust. Next category is witnessing. According to Yehuda Bauer, all testimony is archival information and serves meritoriously. And this discussion was, I think, present yesterday as well and this morning. The approach is found in works featuring survivors retelling their story, often in the midst of revisiting sites of past trauma and events. Claude Lanzmann's Shoah would be in this category, but because of its uniqueness, it deserves more than just being termed a witnessing film. Testimony films are not only reserved for museum archives, but have entered the territory of popular cinema as well. And films such as Kitty Returns to Auschwitz, which was one of the earliest to garner a wide circulation, and at the same time, they're capable of maintaining an acceptable moral compass. In presenting survivors to audiences, a most curious and quite genuine example, this is where we disagree, is the 1952 appearance of Hannah Bloch-Kohner on the television show, This Is Your Life. While maligned later for being frivolous and trivializing, the truth is that Hannah was not portraying anything but her real self and demonstrated a survivor in her particular circumstance of life at that time. Successful, beautiful woman. It also exposed an American audience to something they had not seen or heard before or after, a Holocaust survivor. In all aforementioned examples, the discussion centers on non-fictional works, but the majority of cinema is fictionalized, possessing various degrees of honesty, dignity, and integrity. To reach a wider audience and to maintain appeal, commercialization was inescapable, and the Holocaust miniseries epitomizes the effort. Jeffrey Chandler, among others, has opened a dialogue with the term docudrama. Yet docudrama is only another name for fiction, as noted in the part of the word called drama. However, the leap to storytelling aimed at a wide audience introduces complex issues, including sponsorship, commercialization, and stardom, all of which will be part of the later part of the work. Fiction. The question is fiction, when and what? This was written by Libby Saxon, who makes a very good clear for authenticity, and she states, fiction becomes the condition or possibility for authentic testimony, while a past that is never reconstructed is nonetheless represented through the bodies of the active witnesses as they relive, reenact, are acted by, or incarnate their traumas. Accounting for the compelling case for fiction is the fact that the Holocaust is receding into distant past. I think I need to have a drink. the Holocaust is receding into distant past, and also the audiences born after World War II are scattered throughout the globe. Therefore, we see a cultural mediation of memory for those affected by the Holocaust and the first, second, and third generation descendants. A discussion of memory and culture is necessary to discuss these works. To begin with, it is important to recognize the difference between cultures directly affected by the Holocaust, as in Israel, and the larger diaspora populations, and in all other parts of the world. And I think this morning's panel was an illustration of the cultural spread. Commercial considerations. Recognizing that, what number slide is that? Okay. Recognizing that production needs to be financially successful does not necessarily reconcile with acceptance. Notable examples of poor taste in advertisers' influence include, yesterday was discussed, the American Gas Company, which sponsored the Playhouse 90 television production, bleeping out the word gas. And the presence of musical scores in virtually all works of cinema and television add a further dimension of outside agency. Additionally, in television, the presence of commercial breaks at specific and regular intervals creates a very uncomfortable relationship with the script and narrative. And now let's just discuss outcomes and consequences, which often are not at all intended or predicted. The most unexpected consequences were seen in the reaction to the television miniseries. This is from Schindler's List, which was broadcast in April '78 in four nights on NBC. Although it won several awards and was highly acclaimed by critics, Shoah survivors were very upset by this. Okay, Elie Wiesel termed it as untrue and offensive. But the popularity was unexpected. The nightly viewership in the U.S. was 15 to 20 million households. So many people watched it that in New York City, during commercial breaks, the water pressure went down from people running to the toilet and flushing it. It was shown in Germany in 1979, and the estimates were that about 20 million, half the population of West Germany, watched it. When it was aired, the police stations in West Germany were flooded by calls, people regretting or confessing to their role at Kristallnacht, or during that scene. And what happened in Germany is that as a result of this, an unexpected consequence, legislation was reenacted to extend the statute of limitations for war criminals. And the other effect that may or may not be, I think it is somewhat linked to this, to the miniseries, is the U.S. Holocaust Museum, because right about the same time President Jimmy Carter established the President's Commission on the Holocaust, and it was chaired by Elie Wiesel, and 2 years later the Holocaust Museum began production. In other words, they enacted a law that included the creation of a memorial. So you never know where some fictional television or movie might lead to. Now, the culture and memory of cinema today is all separate and follows what we have just shown or seen. Pierre Nora, noted for his memory work, stated that history is perpetually suspicious of memory, and its true mission is to suppress and destroy it. And then he offers the alternative, the discussion of trace. Offering archival footage and witnessing are certainly include the elements of trace. And trace then becomes post-memory of survivor generations and their contemporaries. So at a certain level, the film is addressing the post-memory audience. And now the question becomes one of latitude and degree of deviation from what is accepted historiography. By definition, a Holocaust narrative is constructed on trauma. However, in the telling of trauma, according to Ruth Lays, a professor of humanities at Johns Hopkins, the historical examples in trauma work are different from what is a psychological perspective, and he regards it as the crisis of representation posed by trauma in our time. Dominic LaCapra also examined this, and he considered 3 varieties of post-traumatic representation in his writings. 3 categories. 1 is denial of trauma, 2 is working through the trauma, and 3, repeating trauma by reenacting it. Suffice it the case that most film is doing the 3rd option, some kind of reenactment framed in the verisimilitude to the Holocaust, and other narratives are to be avoided. That's the general movement of most of these Holocaust films. However, for some producers and writers, that which is universal or cosmopolitan in representation is their primary role, and includes humor, illusion, trivializations, some for good cause, but often for political exploitation and anything but authentic. Unavoidably, we encounter the exploitation category, works which may not or should not merit serious consideration, except for the fact of success and visibility. Utilizing violence gratuitously and borrowing Holocaust imagery is a clear perversion of a trauma cinema. Such examples have unfortunately found their way into what's termed Holocaust genre. The Inglourious Basterds discussed here this morning is one of those. Why any movie that has the word Mengele in it should make the list of top all-time Holocaust movies, examples are Boys from Brazil and Marathon Man, is inexplicable. They're not Holocaust movies. So at this point, we encounter an unexpected agency, which belongs to really to scholars, filmmakers, and producers and critics, including us. And this is a discussion of Holocaust representation in film. I picked out an article by Levinson, who is a kind of an expert in discussing Holocaust film. His article is called The Maimed, 2 minutes left, The Maimed Body and Tortured Soul, Holocaust Survivors in American Film. In it, he discusses The Night Porter, which was discussed, I think, by Damian Garofalo, at least the movie maker was. In The Night Porter, you see the victim, this woman who now has some crazy torrid love affair with a Nazi, and here she's in a scene naked, dancing with Nazis. This is nuts. Actually, in plain English, this is nuts. Okay, and the problem, the real problem, is not the filmmaker. It's actually a very interesting film. The problem is the scholar, Levinson, discusses this in his article called Holocaust Trauma. That's the problem. So, I'm doing good on time. So the problem I think that we're now faced with is it representation or reperpetration. I want to conclude with a film clip from Agnieszka Holland's film Europa, Europa, which is the story of a biography based on Solomon Perel's biography. And Solomon Perel cooperated with the filmmaker in making the film. So I'm going to show you the last scene where he and his brother find each other miraculously in a DP camp and then go to Israel. Okay, now comes the trick.
Verließ Europa und emigrierte nach Palästina. Und als ich Söhne bekam, habe ich nur für einen kurzen Augenblick gezögert, sie beschneiden zu lassen.
שבת אחים גם יחד, בני מה טוב ומה נעים. שבת אחים גם יחד, הנה מה טוב. שבת אחים גם יחד, הנה מה.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Zahava Moerdler. She's currently a law student at Fordham University and an MA student at the University of Haifa. Her undergraduate thesis was on the use of witness testimony at the Eichmann trial as means of opening up Holocaust memory in Israel. She's currently working on her master's thesis on the restitution process of the 1990s and its effect on American culture and understanding of the Holocaust.
No, it's fine. It's interesting. I usually wind up on time. It's fine. Can we just...
You know what? I can present without it if it doesn't work. Oh, it's working. Okay. Was willing to work without it. In 1961, as the Eichmann trial proceedings were coming to a close in Jerusalem, the lead prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, called another witness to the stand who recounted a terrible story from his time in the ghetto and labor camps. The witness, Dr. Buzminski, told how he saw an SS officer whip a young boy 80 times. The doctor said that ordinarily a person could not survive even 50 blows, and he assumed that the boy had died. Hausner turned to the witness and said, "Do you see the boy in the courtroom today?" The witness then pointed to one of the police officers sitting behind Hausner and said, "There is the boy." That moment in the trial, like so many others, was one of drama and suspense. Hausner skillfully employed moments of drama to further his goals for the trial. He had a didactic mission. He wanted to use the courtroom to encourage survivors to tell their stories. He wanted to promote a gelling of Israeli society for the new Jews, the Israeli Sabra native community, to finally understand and to speak to the immigrant survivor population. Through his strategy of using witness testimony as opposed to documents, he allowed for stories that had been silenced for so long to finally be voiced. And even though that officer did not get the chance to tell his story at the trial, it was nonetheless listened to and heard. Television and media in general reflects the trends, attitudes, and emotions that individuals of a society are experiencing at a given time. It measures the important narratives of society and is an indicator of social change and shifts. Even more, media is indicative of pervasive narratives promoted by the states. Media not only taps into the individual's experiences, but also those of the society as a whole. Take, for example, Oprah Winfrey. Her television show, which aired from 1986 to 2011, was incredibly popular and one of the highest rated of its time. Winfrey skillfully discussed topics that penetrated American culture and popular culture of that time. According to Eva Illouz, Winfrey's show actually created a multi-layered structure that staged and performed narratives of suffering that resonated with her audience. Essentially, Winfrey was able to tap into the pervasive victimhood culture of the 90s and her ability to respond to and voice the individual's plight, along with her understanding and ability to use the rising victimhood culture fueled her popularity. Examples like Winfrey point to the importance of television and media in general in demonstrating trends and narratives pervasive to society. These ideas translate into the realm of Holocaust media as well. The narratives American society promoted were reflected in the media representing Holocaust of the time. While the media is an excellent gauge of societal sentiments, the courtroom is another place where society and narratives intersect. There is a distinct interplay between law and society. Each feeds into the other and fuels the other. Particularly when analyzing Holocaust narratives, it is important to keep an eye on landmark cases and how these cases represent the ever-changing dimension of Holocaust memory. Both the Eichmann trial and the Nuremberg trials were examples of what scholar Shoshana Feldman called monumental legal history. Both trials reflected the viewpoint society had on the Holocaust during the decades following them. They were show trials, the goal being to bring closure after the atrocities of war and genocide rather to mete out a just trial. And just like television or media in general, they were staged and performed in a very specific way. Both the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trial were dramatized. Both focused upon individual perpetrators rather than on whole nation states, and both totalized the evidence and catastrophe of the crimes committed. Scholar Annette Vivierka noted that Nuremberg cast light on the perpetrators and on the mechanisms that generated war and sought to criminalize war and its instigators, while Eichmann cast the spotlight now on the victims. While the Nuremberg trials focused on documentary evidence, the Eichmann trial relied upon witness testimony, both from historians and victims, in order to facilitate the drama. My research suggests that the landmark Holocaust trials are an excellent way to gauge the representation of Holocaust media and memory. by analyzing the interplay between the representation of Holocaust at Nuremberg and Eichmann, as well as how the media embraced and perpetuated those narrative trends, it is clear that both the courtroom and Hollywood industry manufactured and promoted society's understanding of the Holocaust at a given time. I will present two examples of how the courtroom reflects the same narratives as the media. First, through the Nuremberg trials, or specifically the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, in 1945, and second, the Eichmann trial in 1961. The Nuremberg trial used documentary evidence and even films, as Gabe mentioned, in order to depict the atrocities. It was predominantly focused on that documentary evidence, and as such, very few witnesses were called to present and to give testimony at the trials. And additionally, there was very little Holocaust focus at the trials. It was about victor's justice, not about justice for the Holocaust. Only a few dozen witnesses were invited to testify at Nuremberg, and most of the evidence used by the prosecution was from translated German documents. The focus on documentation was intentional for two reasons. First, towards the end of the war and immediately following, American officers were dispatched to accumulate the vast stores of Nazi documentation. The prosecution at Nuremberg wanted to make use of this incredible resource. Furthermore, courts placed more credence in documentary evidence rather than in witness testimony. A document very rarely lies, whereas a witness might distort or might forget a memory. As historian Lawrence Douglas noted, the prosecution at Nuremberg was a didactic paradigm modeled around documentary proof, meaning the educational goal was specifically centered on the documentary evidence. For this reason, Gideon Hausner noted in his memoir that Nuremberg was efficient and simple, but it also was one of the reasons that the proceedings there failed to reach the hearts of men. In fact, one journalist who was in attendance at the IMT noted that the trials were actually a citadel of boredom. The Holocaust was essentially missing from the Nuremberg trials. Similarly, Holocaust memory in the 1940s and 50s was not pervasive like it would become later in the 80s and 90s. Peter Novick discusses how the Holocaust was essentially absent from both American and American Jewish life during the 40s and 50s. By contrast, scholar Hansia de Noor argues that Holocaust was not silent, but merely subdued during those decades. It was focused on communal representations, so there would be a discussion about the Holocaust perhaps at the dinner table once the children had left, or in a memorial by a camp during a Holocaust memorial session. Whether seen as completely silent or merely subdued, the implication is clear. Both American society and the American Jewish community were not going to push those narratives. The television show This Is Your Life, which we've spoken about, I assume, a lot here at the conference, like Oprah Winfrey Show, had its pulse on the cultural narrative of the time. The show was a television documentary series that aired from 1948 to 1952. During each episode, a guest was invited, and his or her story was told through the introduction of a friend or a relative from her past or his past. Guests included Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy and a survivor of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and Ralph Edwards, the show's host, narrated the guest's biography. In the episode with survivor Hannah Block-Kohner, the presenter tells Hannah about the things she experienced. Even in moments when he isn't presenting the narrative to her, her family members and friends arrive to tell her where they know her from. It isn't about Hannah's expression of her narrative or her experiences. Rather, agency is taken from her, and the story is told to her. Although she lacks agency and a voice, the story is nevertheless authentic. The structural narrative is not perhaps how she would have told the story herself, but the story itself gets a place in the realm of media and social consciousness. And I would agree with the earlier discussion, the TV show created the framework, and Hannah was merely a vessel for that narrative. However, again, I believe, as we discussed, that this is an authentic representation, especially given the nature of Holocaust at the time. The Eichmann trial stands in sharp contrast to the methodology and memory enforced by the Nuremberg trials. The trial used 111 witnesses. The testimony was listened to live by audiences that included journalists from all around the world. In fact, Hannah Arendt is one of the most famous journalists who was in attendance, and her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, is incredibly famous itself. In Israel, people were perched by the radios listening to the proceedings, and around the world, the trial was televised. So individuals sitting in the United States in their homes could watch as the witnesses told their story and express their emotions in their own way. This allowed for greater access to individualized narratives. Although the prosecution obviously led the stories in a particular manner to prove a point, the survivors had a choice in how they told their stories and the way in which it would be presented to the audience. Take Yechiel Dinur, or Katsetnik, for example. Many believe his testimony was the climax of the trial. As he talked about Auschwitz, this lonely planet that no one could possibly understand or reach, he was overcome by emotion and he fainted. And although this was an involuntary action, it nonetheless expressed an authentic representation of his experience and attachment to this past. Additionally, although those who rebelled, the ghetto fighters or partisans, were featured to present a particular Holocaust narrative, one that was dominant in Israeli society at the time, survivors with many different experiences and stories were allowed to tell those stories from their own perspectives. Perhaps for the first time, Israeli society listened to many different types of narratives. Not only the stories of those who felt most comfortable telling them, like the partisans and ghetto fighters, who were involved in politics and thus had an outlet with which to tell their stories, and who also felt more comfortable telling them because it was stories of heroism, not sheep to the slaughter, but rather those who rebelled. But again, the Eichmann trial allowed for silenced stories to finally be told. This new focus on the individual is most clearly seen through the media in the hit 1970s miniseries Holocaust. The drama followed individuals through their experiences during the war. What is so interesting about the miniseries is that many different pervasive narratives were given space in the show. People in the ghettos, in the camps, labor camps, concentration camps, hiding, rebels, all those different narratives were presented from the vantage point of the individual. Although the miniseries was produced over a decade after Eichmann, it is clear that between the trial and the miniseries, a shift occurred in both Israeli and American society that promoted the individual's narrative. As my colleague Gabe so eloquently described, Carter's initiative for the commission and the start of the United States Holocaust Museum started in that period following the docudrama. The Holocaust memoir became popularized also within that time span, and survivors spoke up more and more about their experiences. The media, and particularly television, has been an incredible means by which to feel the pulse of social consciousness and attention. In the realm of Holocaust memory, media now stands at the epicenter in many ways, in that it provides access to a new generation of individuals grappling with this memory and history. In the 1990s, American lawyers began approaching Holocaust cases in a completely different fashion. With the rise of class action lawsuits, civil suits were brought to the courts, where Holocaust survivors would join forces to sue German, Austrian, and Swiss banks, and even governments for reparations for their time in forced labor camps. These suits were dramatized, just like Nuremberg and Eichmann before them. Intrigue followed the proceedings, and restitution became, in many ways, the new criminal trial. This also reflected another shift in Holocaust memory. Whereas after Eichmann, individual narratives became popularized, in the 1990s, victimhood culture propelled the Holocaust to the center of Hollywood attention. In fact, Kate Winslet famously joked that she chose to do a Holocaust film because she wanted an Oscar. Holocaust films like Schindler's List and Defiance in the 2000s incorporate Hollywood drama with Holocaust atrocity. I wonder how the trajectory of Holocaust memory and media will change as technology develops. Whereas in the past, access to trials like Eichmann and Nuremberg were limited to scholars and researchers who would take the time to uncover the transcripts and to watch the film, today they are both available online, both transcripts and film. In fact, on YouTube, you can watch the entire proceedings of the Eichmann trial. Will this increased access affect media representation of the Holocaust? Will these paradigmatic show trials that demonstrated the interplay between law and society continue to affect generations of scholars and individuals? Or will society slowly move away from the narrative of the Holocaust as memory, particularly in the United States, and as these memories and narratives shift and adapt? These are merely a few of the burning questions that arise in the age of technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for the time discipline. Our final speaker is Madene Shachar. She's a master's student at the University of Haifa. She's a veteran educator at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel since 2000. Her work includes guiding and curriculum development in the Children's Memorial Museum, as well as the History Museum. In a joint project with the Jewish Resistance Heritage Museum in New York City, Madene was co-writer of 6 Israel-based biographies in the educational program. It's called Coming of Age During the Holocaust, Coming of Age Now. In 2012, she co-authored an article entitled The Role of Experiential Learning in the Holocaust Education, and her research interests include Holocaust education, Holocaust memorials, and the representation on the Holocaust in the museum space.
Technical. Okay. Hope for the best. It's not going to start with that, so it's okay. Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm. Oh, Philip. It's. Is it okay? Oh, no, it's not. Oh no. Yeah, but it's the wrong.
It's the other way around now. And,
I can also do it without the.
Das ist der wahrscheinlich.
ist der?
Kann auch da sein, der.
Wieso?
Der war's.
Ja, aber jetzt ist es umgekehrt. Das, was man am Computer sieht, sollte man draußen sehen und das, was man...
Ich habe nur die Steckverbindung festgemacht.
Okay.
Oh, it almost looks good.
Well, almost.
Almost. No. Oh well. Do you want me to put it on mic? Right? What would it help?
Your computer?
Well. Those Apple computers. Seriously. Oh.
Yeah, let's put it in
You want to try in mine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. So, you have the presentation.
I think it's here. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Where's my PowerPoint? It's here. Meanwhile, I was going to say you can look at the vineyards of Israel under snow. Isn't that pretty? Open agency there. Okay? Yay. Okay. Well, it's all mixed up, so I don't know what happened to it. Whatever. Maybe I'll just do it without it, and that's it. Is that one okay? So we'll start from there. Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. The trilogy project that I am going to talk about today was the brainchild of 2 men. One, a Holocaust survivor, Antik Zuckerman, founding member of the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz and Museum, who during World War II was one of the leaders of the Jewish fighting organization in the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the other is Chaim Guri, born and raised in Israel, a central figure among the artists of the generation of the War of Independence in Israel, and one of the first Israeli poets and novelists to bring the Holocaust to Israeli collective consciousness. The story goes, as Guri explains in numerous writings, that Antik Zuckerman asked him in the early 1970s to prepare a short film about Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. What was supposed to be a 30-minute documentary film turned into a 12-year project, 3 films, and one of Israel's most important documents on the Holocaust, Jewish and non-Jewish resistance, and the Bricha, the illegal immigration of Holocaust survivors to Israel. Okay. Just a little bit about the Ghetto Fighters' House. The Ghetto Fighters' House Museum was established along with the kibbutz with the same name on April 19th, 1949, the 6th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising by Holocaust survivors, around 152 Holocaust survivors. That's the museum. As seen in the museum's mission statement, one of its tasks has always been to foster the research and documentation projects that deepen our understanding of the Holocaust, the causes of it, and its effects and consequences. For Zuckerman, it was a natural choice to choose Chaim Guri, who had a close relationship with members of the Ghetto Fighters kibbutz, but also had a connection to many Holocaust survivors. He himself was sent to Europe in 1947 to smuggle Jewish Holocaust survivors into Palestine, what I call the Bricha. He attests that his encounter with the survivors of the Nazi camps changed his life, and that the experience became an obsessive theme throughout his work. Later, Antik Zuckerman and Guri met at the Eichmann trial, where Guri serves as a reporter and Zuckerman as a witness. The first of the trilogy movies, The 81st Blow, was released in 1975 and deals with the Holocaust. The second film, The Last Sea, which came out in 1979, deals with the post-war Europe, the Bricha, the illegal immigration from 1944 to 1948, survivors' experiences in Palestine and later in the new Jewish state. And the final movie, Flames and Ashes, came out in 1985 and deals with Jewish and non-Jewish resistance during World War II. According to Avizar, the discourse on the Holocaust in Israeli collective consciousness has been profound and traumatic, and that cinema, as a quote-unquote articulator of historical narrative, can give insight into how Israel not only represents the Holocaust, but tries to come to terms with the Holocaust. Though Avizar claims that Israeli culture had an obsession with the Holocaust that reflects a quote-unquote deep psychological Holocaust complex, unquote, examining the structure of the trilogy may present us with another way of understanding Israeli society's discourse on the Holocaust in the 1970s and the 1980s. But before looking at the trilogy, I would like to set a foundation for my discussion. First of all, what is the role of cinema in the representation of historical drama like the Holocaust? For example, Josh Hirsch deals with the following 2 questions. What is the role of cinema in the transmission of an historical drama from eyewitnesses to the public? And what is the role of the post-traumatic cinema in creating a language of representation? He claims that the goal is not to traumatize the spectator, very interesting, but to, quote-unquote, invoke a post-traumatic historical consciousness, a kind of textual compromise between the senselessness of the initial traumatic encounter and the sense-making apparatus of a fully integrated historical narrative. When considering the Holocaust as a historical drama, Hartman has an interesting perspective on the ongoing representations of the Holocaust, not specifically in Israel, but globally. Hartman sees the global focus on the Holocaust not as an obsession, but rather a reflection of how a call for closure is still not possible, and that the Holocaust still cannot be relegated to the past. He claims that, quote-unquote, no other event, it seems, has been so thoroughly documented and studied. There lies the implication that we are illegitimately fascinated by it. And so Hartman suggests 2 things concerning the Holocaust. First of all, understanding comes and goes. It has not been progressive. Fundamental questions still remain, and there is no closure. At this stage, he claims, any kind of closure would suggest being silent. In other words, every new generation has to learn about the history of the Holocaust. In making the trilogy, Chaim Guri suggests a more local cultural explanation for Israel's need to deal with the Holocaust. He says we are an historical nation. We are a culture of remembrance, and from generation to generation, and you shall tell your son. The aftershock of the Holocaust is one factor that affects how it is represented. When looking at Israel's society during the 12-year process of preparing the trilogy, The discourse on the Holocaust is affected by a number of milestones, some the direct aftermath of the Holocaust, that also made an impact on the Israeli collective consciousness. Here are just a few examples. Of course, a decade after the Eichmann trial, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, also the UN decision in 1975 equating Zionism with racism, and we could even add the Lebanese war, since the last film was released in 1985. I also added what's going on in cinema, but I'll come back to that afterwards. Though the Eichmann trial gave survivors a chance to speak, allowing their testimonies to become a focus of national attention, Jews who were Sabras, and we heard about this morning, born in Israel or had immigrated to Israel before the Holocaust, namely the new Jew, could only begin a process of empathizing with the Jewish diaspora after the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. The new Jew in Israeli society in general, who had been raised on the ethos of the negation of exile and Jewish culture in the diaspora, in the 1970s felt vulnerable and in danger, with threats to the existence of the State of Israel. This existential turning point could allow Israeli society to now understand the suffering of the Jews in the diaspora during the Holocaust. It is these turning points that add to what Jablonka claims are the labyrinths of Holocaust perception in Israeli society. She reminds us that, like any interpretation of an historical event, there's never just one specific narrative. And when looking at cinema, as we are in this conference, there are a myriad of ways in which the Holocaust is represented, and for many different reasons and for different agendas. It is with an understanding of the role of cinema in providing a language of interpretation, and that the so-called obsession can be interpreted through another prism, namely as an ongoing and multi-generational processing of the aftershock of the Holocaust, that we can now look at the trilogy. The trilogy is an interesting historical compilation film, combining the visual and emotional power of archival footage with the explanatory power of the historical narrative, which is dominated by survivor testimony. Moreover, with the guiding conductor's hand of Chaim Guri, the trilogy is also an artistic masterpiece that reflects the crossroad in Israeli society where the diaspora Jews, the survivors of the Holocaust, and the Israeli Jewish community find a common language through which the historical narrative can be told. And now for the trilogy. By the way, has anybody ever seen any of the Chaim Guri movies besides our Israeli? I'm just curious. Anybody seen the movies? No. Okay. Just checking. So a little bit about the structure of the movies. All three films follow the same concept. Authentic footage and the testimony of survivors, as well as music, are the three venues of transmission. There is no script and no interpretive narrative. The documentary film footage is presented like a newsreel. The trilogy does not try to reconstruct or invent, but rather deals with the mass of received materials. The use of the Eichmann trial and testimonies of survivors that Guri interviewed for the other two films, the first film was the Eichmann trial and the other two interviews with survivors, sitting in their homes, listening to their stories, is central to the films. The images, the authentic film footage itself, need the voices of the survivors to humanize rather than cause voyeurism. The place of voice is essential in the trilogy. There is a mixture of voices, different accents, different languages, both genders, that together form the complex patchwork of testimony. And this is something that narrative and documentary and fictional films usually lack. The musical score as well. Each film has its unique musical score created together with Yosef Bar Chaim, Jewish music, ballads written by Chaim Guri, music from the Aliyah Bet period, which is the period of the illegal immigration, or the Bricha, as well as the use of iconic artists, the famous Israeli singer Shule Natan and poet Natan Alterman. And finally, the use of poetic license, the use of biblical, Talmudic references, the representation of the testimony that was given in the Eichmann trial. All these help the trilogy transcend the historical compilation genre, adding a language of representation familiar to the Israeli audience. The structure of the trilogy for Israeli society allowed for two very important processes to take place. First of all, with its healing potential, the films provided the generation of survivors, as well as Israeli society at large, a venue through which they can, as a unified society, deal with the trauma of the Holocaust, as well as Israeli society's sense of vulnerability. Second, the induction of the trilogy as part of the Jewish tradition of remembrance, iskor, and cultural transmission. And I think we have to go. And now a closer look at the three films. The 81st Blow, which was released in 1975. This is the first documentary of the trilogy produced under the auspices of the Ghetto Fighters' House, or Bet Lochomei HaGhettoot. This Academy Award-nominated film is drawn mainly from Nazi film footage and Jewish eyewitness testimony, much of the latter given at the Eichmann trial, like I mentioned before. The film opens with a montage of scenes of workaday Jewish life in pre-Hitler Eastern Europe, then describes the rise of Nazism in Germany, the German occupation of Poland, the various stages of the final solution, and instances of Jewish resistance. The name of the film, it's also Chaim Guri's book, reflects one of the main reasons for the healing potential that I mentioned above. And I think Zahava told a little bit of this story beforehand, but I'm just going to remind us. During the Eichmann trial, one of the witnesses, a doctor, had given testimony about the young boy who had been beaten 80 times. And of course, the doctor thought that the boy had died. What happened during his testimony is that the prosecutor asked if the doctor sees the boy in the courtroom, to which he replied yes, to the surprise of all those who were watching and listening. He pointed to Michael Goldman Gilad, who was working for the prosecution in preparing for the trial. This was a dramatic moment in the trial. When Gilad talked to Guri and Zuckerman during one of the breaks, they asked why he had not given witness beforehand. He wasn't on the list. Gilad explained that he had told his story about the beating to a couple, who, thinking that Gilad did not understand Hebrew, spoke to each other and commented that the Holocaust victims make up such unbelievable stories. Zuckerman then replied, after hearing this, that was the 81st blow. Guri's use of testimony from the Eichmann trial reflects how the Holocaust had become a Jewish story in Israeli society in the aftermath of the trial. As Jablonka claims, in Israel, the trial turned the Holocaust into a Jewish story, a major and at times the only component in the Israelis' sense of identity. The Holocaust finally penetrated the Hebrew language, becoming a part of the discourse between Israel and the rest of the world and among Israelis themselves. The survivors had been integrated into Israeli society, almost, one might say, as a sacred community. It is through the survivors that Israelis have been able to connect directly with the Holocaust, unquote. This trial and the witness testimony were part of a nation-building process, putting central processes in Israeli culture that are connected to its Jewish past in general and the Holocaust in particular. So as a formative event, these testimonies remained powerfully vivid in the minds of many Israelis, including those of Asian and African origin, who could identify with the trial and were absorbed into Israeli culture as well as the public, educational, and intellectual discourse. In the 81st Blow, the musical score included ballads that were written by Chaim Guri, and like a Greek choir, take us through the different themes of the movie, with the familiar voice of popular Israeli singer Shula Natan and the words of Chaim Guri. For the Israeli audience, listening to the voice of Shula Natan, who in 1967 had sang Jerusalem of Gold after the city was reunified as a result of the Six-Day War, and hearing the same familiar voice now singing about the Holocaust, bridged the history of the diaspora Jews with that of Israeli Jews. There is a common voice for a common history. I will not put the clip on, but I will read the first what is it called in English, the bite? The first house, the first phrase, of the song. It's called the 81st Blow. On the street pavement he laid still. Schwamberger beats him for all to see. Dr. Boschminke saw him there. The young man stays silent, silent like the dead. He kept counting. Suddenly he got to 70, to 79, to 80. On the street pavement he laid still. Schwamberger is breathing heavily, his arm heavy from the beating. After a while he went to rest and left there, the young man behind. The doctor saw him moving and was glad he is still alive. If nobody understood what I was saying, just a little bit from the ballad. Guri also uses the structure of faceless and nameless survivor testimonies in order to bring back agency to the survivors. One of the strongest examples in the testimony, once again, Zahava mentioned this, is that of Yechiel Dino, Katzetnik, which is heard at the end of the film. During the actual trial, while giving testimony, Denor fainted, and this traumatic event became a symbol of the suffering and the trauma that faced the survivors. In the film, Guri returns agency to the testimony. Describing his 2 years in Auschwitz, Denor said, "Time there runs differently than it does here on the face of the earth. Residents of that planet had no names. They had no parents, no children. They didn't dress as we dress here. They weren't born there and didn't give birth. They breathed according to different laws of nature. They didn't live according to the laws of the world here, and they didn't die. Their name was a number." To this new generation of audience, Denor's words are given the metaphorical spotlight and not his fainting at the trial. And like Hirsch claims, the goal was not to traumatize the spectator, but to invoke a post-traumatic historical consciousness. Furthermore, from a Jewish standpoint, this was a tikkun olam, which means that Guri takes the testimony that was dramatized because of Denor's fainting and brings back this agency to his words, what he was trying to say. The Last Sea is the second film. Wait a minute, one sec. Right here I am, sorry. The Last Sea came out in 1979. In 1945, multitudes of liberated survivors of the death camps find themselves homeless in Europe, sought to immigrate to Israel. This film recounts the survivors' journeys, including their danger-fraught passages through the borders of Europe and across the Mediterranean, confrontations with the British Navy, detention camps on Cyprus, and their final vindicating arrival in the land of Israel. The second in the epic trial of the trilogy of Israeli documentaries about the Holocaust and its aftermath, this film was edited together from over 30 hours of rare archival footage, a 2-year research process that brought the producers of the film to museums and archives and private homes in Israel as well as through Europe. By the way, when I'm talking about private homes, I'm talking about attics and under beds as well, not just sitting somewhere in a file, but actually hidden, literally hidden in homes. Once again, the visuals are accompanied by the anonymous testimonies of witnesses, forming what the filmmakers called a historical poem. Guri listened to hundreds of witnesses. Many had, until this point, remained silent over the years, finding it difficult to retell their story. Chaim Bartov, journalist and author, wrote a column in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv on the screening of The Last Sea in Israel. He describes the movie as representing that moment or intersection in history that the Jewish nation from the diaspora, that it lost its communities, its leadership, and millions of its brothers and sisters, meets the soldiers, like Chaim Guri, from the land of Israel, start their plight through the dangerous escape routes through Europe and finally to the shores of Israel. That moment that he describes as a great energy that allowed them to start over and in many cases take an active part in the creation of the state of Israel. Once again, the healing potential is realized. In this film, the accompanying songs sung by the choirs from the Ghetto fighters' kibbutz, as well as from members of another kibbutz, Kibbutz Yagur, which is, by the way, where I live, are representative of the songs that the survivors sang, as well as those who took part in bringing them to Israel. One of the producers who helped to produce this film, Benny Shiloh from Kibbutz Yagur, wrote in the kibbutz newsletter in 1978 that some of the younger members of the choir did not know the songs, which further strengthens the feeling that the children of Israel know more about the exodus from Egypt than they do about the exodus from Europe, Morocco, or Baghdad in the years following the war. The name of the film, The Last Sea, is an example of how Jewish elements are used to represent modern historical events. It is taken from a verse in the Bible, from the story of the death of Moses, a well-known verse in Israeli culture in which God shows to Moses all the land that his people will receive after 40 years of wandering in the desert. And I put out in blue the translation into English, the Hebrew version, which is The Last Sea. In English, it's called As Far as the Mediterranean Sea. So even lost in translation, if you hear the name in Hebrew, Hayam Acharon, the last sea, immediately there's a connection to the biblical verse. The last sea also has that symbolic feeling. It's the last place I'm going to have to go. I'm now home. The Mediterranean Sea is just a really beautiful beach that you can go swimming all year round in Israel. A very different understanding and perspective. Though lost in translation, the saga of the Bricha, this illegal immigration to Israel, is no less epical than the biblical Exodus. The movie ends with a song whose lyrics are written in 1946 by the famous Israeli poet Natan Alterman, who, by the way, was born in Warsaw, who was also involved in moving immigrants from ship to shore. The ballad reminds us that the history of the Bricha had been one of a silent victory that today, through the venue of cinema, provides the well-deserved tribute to the illegal Jewish immigrants, Holocaust survivors, between 1944 and 1948, overcame incredible hardships to get to Palestine, and by their numbers and presence helped to make inevitable the birth of the Jewish state. From the testimonies in the movie, we hear that, quote unquote, the illegal immigration was one of the greatest episodes in the liberation of nations and salvation of human beings. Another quote, the most moral fight in the struggle for our revival. And the last quote, people don't understand, okay, and don't want to listen. And again, some words from the poem. It's called Our Fleet, not very well known these days, but back in 1946, it was actually published in the children's newspaper to learn about the Bricha, or the illegal immigration. And now for the last film, and I have 2 minutes. Against the backdrop of Shoah Landsman and Holocaust in the USA, the movie holds true to the original concept of providing authentic, rare, and never-seen-before footage now available after the fall of the USSR. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why this film is out of order. The Bricha is supposed to be the last stage coming to Israel and the resistances during the war. But the footage was not available, but it was known. And so Chaim Guri and the producers decided to wait until this archival film material would be available, and you can see the difference of 6 years. Guri was well aware of the competition in the realm of cinematic representation of the Holocaust in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and in one of the protocols in which the structure of the movie is discussed, he stresses, we have no intention at this time of producing a Hollywood version of a narrative film about the uprising, in which the actors who star in it will represent the heroes. As well, there is no sense in creating another television program, though we should not totally disregard this possibility. The goal is an additional historical movie that is related to the previous ones, and with its similarities and differences, we must acknowledge that many things that we were told as part of those who belong to that time are almost completely foreign to the new spectator. Against the background of archival film footage and still photographs, the voices of 120 survivors tell their stories. Among them, Mark Adelman, Israel Gutman, Yitzhak Arad, and Antik Zuckerman, and include first-hand accounts of Sobibor and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the voice of the female Jewish resistors, but also the testimony of those survivors who describe how armed resistance was not an option and too dangerous. Another discourse is reflected in this last movie. For example, when the question, why didn't the Jews resist more, is part of the discourse, the images of the defeated Russian soldiers is presented as an alternative discourse in the movie. Flames of Ashes deals with a subject, the Jewish resistance, at a time when the present generation, at that time, was turning to the generation of survivors for answers to their questions, and this was the challenge. Some of the topics that Guri wanted to bring out in this last film of Jewish resistance, or resistance in general. Why did a Jewish resistance, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, burst forth? What were the goals of the resistance? Who were the resistors? What is resistance? And how do you decide who is a hero? One of the survivors, in Yiddish, reflects the new discourse on resistance and the myth of Jewish passiveness, a discourse that has been developing in Israel and was also influenced not only by the Eichmann trial, but the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, receiving a legitimate stage in flames in the ashes. Who is more heroic? One who goes in the woods to fight with a gun, or one who decides to go that last road and die with his family? The movie ends with a montage, and here I'm going to finish. The movie ends with a montage of participants in the Jewish resistance, with the narration of Mordechai Anilevich's last letter to Antik Zuckerman, and finally, Rachel Auerbach's tombstone, in which the names of the resistors, some with the biblical names Avraham, Yitzchak, Rachel, Sarah, are read aloud, once again connecting them to a common Jewish history. And I'm going to close. Cinema that deals with the Holocaust in many ways reflects where society is at a specific moment, yet can also bring to light traces of a different period, can blur the concept of categorization of post-Holocaust film, documentary film, and fiction. This is an ongoing challenge for researchers to dig deeper, to explore the specific examples of Holocaust representation and society's perception of the Holocaust via the media of film. The trilogy offered a new generation in Israel that language of representation, not allowing the Holocaust to be relegated to the past and bringing it to the forefront, a new discourse, one more complex, more inclusive, and yet leaving many fundamental questions without closure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for the discussion. Are there any questions? Yes, please.
In fact, 2 questions. And I think the first is for Gabriel Mayer, and I think I will continue the question of Emiliano Pera, who sits next to me, to Jonathan Friedman this morning. I think that for people who are dealing with images, we tend to slide from the idea of good and bad as an aesthetic question to good and bad as a moral question. And I think it's a bit dangerous, and I would like also to clarify a bit this slide, if you can say something about this. And the second question is also for people talking about television and medium, we seem to be not very much concerned with the idea of the properties of the medium. And I'm surprised not to hear much about the material apparatus of television. And that strikes me especially in relation with the notion of authenticity. What do you call authentic? And the question is also for Zahava, I think. Is it something that has been filmed, let's say, in 1944? And then we know that it can be the copy of a copy of a copy, so what is authentic here? So I would be very interested in having your definition of authentic, and maybe if you could give me also the opposite of authentic in your mind. So that's the 2 questions.
So is it the authenticity or the aesthetic that you're...
For you and for Zahava, authenticity, I would like to...
You know, I started with a film clip and said that in that Imsdorf terms that the aesthetic of discomfort. And I think that in historical, this is more or less a historical discourse. It's also cinema discourse. So I think in this sense, aesthetic is not ugly and pretty in the cosmetic sense, but aesthetic as being able to bring forth correctly what's underneath. And as many have said, you cannot ever represent the Holocaust exactly unless it's not representable. So we try to find the aesthetic that best communicates that which is not there.
Okay. To your question of authenticity, I think it's a very powerful and a very important question, and I think most likely everyone will have a different answer to what they find authentic. To me, authenticity is found more easily within the witness themselves, the survivor who tells his or her story. Her story or his story, the way that he or she reflects it and tells it, the emotions, the experience, that's what makes it authentic. Being able to say it how you want to say it when you say it. Now, granted, media and television obviously frames that narrative, but if you look at it as a frame and focus more on the individual and how they want to portray themselves and their story, that's where I would find the authenticity. And as to your second question, I wish I had a good answer. I think it's an excellent question. What is the opposite of authenticity? It's particularly difficult in this topic of media and television because obviously everything is necessarily framed and constructed for a purpose. I wish I had an answer. But if anyone else has an answer, I think that would be...
Yeah, well, I just want to come in because that's why I put up the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy definition. I said, you know what, I'm going to go... I looked actually for a while, what should I say? So I looked for a definitive resource, authority, who gives this definition. Now, how that carries over into actually the cinema is part of why we're all here. So the question then lives on, your question. It's not, it's not a yes or no or one of 4 multiple choices. It keeps on living.
Yes, please. Over there.
You have one question. Yay.
Yes. Thanks. So I don't have an answer either, or maybe I have one, but I don't want to share it right now. I want to pick up. I want to pick up your question about the specificity of the medium, television especially. So, and this is a question for Zahava. So I had the impression when you talked, or how you started your talk, and I have to say, I think it's really. I'm really very interested in this connection of courtroom drama and television. And when you started your talk, I thought, well, it sounds as if there's something like a global Holocaust memory, and I doubt that something like that exists. And I doubt it particularly, and I want to talk about the Eichmann trial in that case because I know a lot about it, that in the 60s, for example, of course, you know, the footage or the coverage of the trial, there were like different national contexts. And I mean, I'm pretty sure you know Jeffrey Chandler and that he differentiates between what was the trial in Israel and how was it perceived in the US, and that they are totally different contexts in a way. So what I would like you to, yeah, if you work on that or go on or working on that, I think it's important to also look into these national differences. Mm-hmm. And the other question about the media. So I'm always wondering how much courtroom and television, or maybe broadcasting, so also radio, if this really works out. So if the logic of broadcasting, you could say, doesn't contradict the courtroom. Because if you think about, and also this is also about the Eichmann trial, Amit, what's his name, Pichevsky, I guess, for example, wrote an article where he says, well, in Israel, radio covered like the first weeks live, and then there was no live radio broadcast in Israel anymore. And then there is also, I guess, the story about Teddy Kollek, but I'm not sure about that, who said, well, the trial is so boring, so we shouldn't have it on radio anymore. And then there's also, because you mentioned Chaim Guri, who also said that there's an anticlimax in the trial. It's 19 weeks, it's too long. So I'm also wondering, so how does, let's say, the courtroom or the proceedings fit the logics of television or of broadcasting? So I'm not sure if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Well, I think a good way to answer that question is in two separate answers. On the first side, I completely agree. The trial was long, 19 weeks. It did get boring. In fact, in Chaim Guri's memoir, or rather his accounts of the trial, he says that he started to pay less attention until the moment when the Ghetto fighters came to give their testimony, and then he was reawakened with vigor, and he paid really close attention because it was a narrative he was used to, it was something that he felt secure with, and it was also something pervasive in Israel at the time. So that element definitely plays a role. I think what I wanted to get across more than the connection between television and the trial is that both reflect changes in society, and it's not that one feeds into the other, but they work in tandem to bring about a new narrative or to demonstrate rising narratives and trends. So like in after Eichmann, you can see the rise of the individual narrative. It's also witnessed in certain television representations or media in general at the time. So there's a connection in that way rather than how the Eichmann trial was presented by the radio and kind of cut off and came back, and how that might have played a role. But the fact that there were witnesses, people who did tell their story, definitely had an impact on this reawakening of listening to survivor stories, or rather awakening. It depends on whether you would say that the immediate aftermath of the war, when there was so much testimony taken down, you can consider that the first awakening of listening to survivor testimony. But I would say that it's more like this dual interaction rather than one feeding into the other. Hope that answers your question.
Bela?
Directly going to the continuation of the anything to do with the media, with television, because I thought that Judith Kalbach exactly was showing in the case of agency that in the East German television exactly the opposite happens. What you are telling us, that East German television is taking away the agency of the survivors. And during your lecture, it came to my mind that in Eastern Europe, exactly the opposite happens, what you are telling us. We have very early testimonies, like in Poland, where there's a competition going on between the survivors in naming or writing down their experiences. We have, Gabriel should know maybe more about that in Transylvania. We have questionnaires about the experiences in the Holocaust, and we have something in Hungary called Datum, which I think Rita made a wonderful article for us, where she exactly shows that it depends on the interviewer how much agency the survivors get. And at the end, and Judith Kaiwa showed that in Eastern Europe, exactly the opposite trend happens, that at the end, these survivors lose their agency. It's just a remark.
Can I first for a second share a little epiphany I had this afternoon, and then we should go on to discussion. But you know, you stand there and you talk, then I sit down here, and my mind wonders, when am I going to go to the bathroom? What will I eat tonight? And it just occurred to me in the middle of all that foolish stuff that except for the gentleman in the front row, all of us, our only visual encounter with the Holocaust has been through media. That's it.
Okay.
I would like to address your really excellent comment, though, about agency and authenticity. And I would have to say that going back to your comment earlier about how it seems like there's one global narrative, but rather each individual state has a different perception, I think that speaks exactly to it. Different nation states' memory or narratives of the Holocaust obviously reflects and speaks to the way that that's reflected in terms of agency and authenticity, you know, changes in narrative and things like that.
Over there. There's a question over there. In first row.
That was an interesting moment at the Nuremberg trial. It was also a bit already boring, all these witnesses, and it looked as if the whole guilt of the perpetrators would not be understood. And at that moment, Taylor decided to show a film. Mm-hmm. And this film changed the whole attitude of the Nuremberg trial. And I believe that is the answer. What is authenticity?
Thank you. Very good.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I was wondering, Zahava, you compared the Nuremberg trials to the Eichmann trial, and you talk about how where the Nuremberg trial is, you know, boring, the Eichmann trial was a lot more energetic because of witness testimony. Do you think that there were any downsides to the excessive witness testimony in the Eichmann trials, or something that they could have added to make it stronger?
I'd like to preface by saying that that's my husband, and I'm going to kill him afterwards because he shouldn't be asking me any questions. Support, sweetheart, not questions. How would I answer that? I'm not Gideon Hausner. He had a very particular plan for the trial. He wanted specifically to use the witnesses. Like I said, he had this didactic mission to, you know, have the new Jew understand the survivor and all these different things that he was intending, and that's why he called so many witnesses. And he even called a historian, Salo Baron, to tell a bit of background about the experiences. And I think it should also be noted that Ben-Gurion was heavily involved in the trial as well. So you have to keep in mind that there was an intention, and if I were doing it, I'm sure things would have been different, but I also would have had to do a lot of research, and as a prosecutor, and I'm not quite sure what the answer would be to that question.
So are you saying that the Eichmann trial was just as manipulated as Hannah Bloch-Hohner?
I think that it was staged and performed like a lot of television shows are. It created a very particular frame, but I think the question of whether Hannah Bloch-Hohner's interview and the television series was a manipulation is an excellent question, and I think people have spoken about that before in previous sessions, and I think it will continue to be a question. The first time I saw it, I was really put off. I thought it was really difficult to watch the survivor not be able to tell her story, her way, with her own experiences. But the next few times that I watched it, and the more I hear people talk about it, the more I realize that it reflects a certain trend and narrative of the time, and you have to keep it within that historical framework to really understand it.
Okay, thank you very much for your papers, for your attention, your questions. And there is a coffee break, and we're going to meet at 4 o'clock in this room. And yeah, enjoy the coffee break.
Thank you.